Good morning, everyone. I am Irene Buzzi, PhD student in Management, Banking and Commodity Science at Sapienza University of Rome. I'm going to present the full paper, Companies' Distress and Legality under the Magnifying Glass of Artificial Intelligence, the contribution of decision trees to identify best practices. The co-authors of the paper are Professors Sergio Barile and Ernesto D'Avanzo. I will go through the following contents: identification of the objectives of the research, brief notes on the background, in particular on the valuation of companies' distress, the general feature of legality rating, and the link between companies' distress and legality rating. Then I will illustrate the methodology and data, moving to the empirical section with the evidence of two experiments. Lastly, I will depict the main findings and propose some conclusions. In relation to the objectives of the research, the study examines whether and how artificial intelligence may facilitate the joint comprehension of companies' distress and companies' legality. The two main subjects of investigation are represented by the company's degree of legality, the evaluation of companies' distress. The first is measured by the legality rating. The second is evaluated through the Altman Z superscript score. The adoption of legality rating allows firms to benefit from some advantages when accessing to credit. For this reason, legality rating is related to the company's creditworthiness and by consequence to the company's distress. Now some notes on the background of the research. The study uses the Altman Z superscript score for the evaluation of companies' distress. As illustrated in the formula, this model considers the following variables: working capital, retained earnings, earnings before interest and taxes, book value of equity, and sales. In relation to the values of Z superscript score, the zone of discrimination allows classifying the companies into three zones: distress, gray, and safe. The values of the Z superscript score must be compared with its critical point, the cutoff point, equal to 2.675, which divides the zone of possible distress from the zone of potential solvency. When the values of Z score are above the cutoff point, firms are considered as potentially healthy, while in case of values of Z score below the cutoff point, the companies go through a possible distress. As consequence, the uncertainty zone, the so-called gray zone, can be better interpreted by dividing it into the zone of possible distress with Z superscript score included between 1.23 and 2.675, and the zone of potential solvency with Z superscript score included between 2.675 and 2.9. In relation to the Z superscript score values, the joint application of the two variables under investigation, that are zone of discrimination and cutoff, is illustrated. For the sake of simplicity, the values of Z superscript score are represented by a Gaussian distribution. With reference to the legality rating, It is a measure of the degree of legality valid within the Italian legal system. It is a voluntary rating granted on application by a party. The competent authority for its release is the Italian Competition Authority. As regards the link between companies' distress and legality rating, according to the Italian legal system, financial institutions should consider legality rating among the parameters to assess the company's creditworthiness. Italian banks take legality rating into account to determine the loan's conditions of disbursement when relevant with respect to the firm's economic and financial performance. Legality rating is related to company's creditworthiness and by consequence to the company's distress. In fact, the higher the creditworthiness, the lower the likelihood of bankruptcy. Going through the methodology and data, the dataset is composed by Italian companies in possession of legality rating. Artificial intelligence is used as methodological approach. In particular, Decision tree is a classification scheme that generates a tree and a set of rules from a given dataset. Decision trees allow to automatically identify a combination of variables from the dataset that explains the two target variables. Experiments employ an implementation of C4.5 decision tree algorithm. C4.5 classifies instances by sorting them down from the root to some leaf nodes, providing the classification of the instances according to the values of a given target attribute. It has been employed in information gain. Experiments performed have been tested using different evaluation metrics. As first evaluation metric, accuracy has been employed. In relation to the empirical section, the first experiment assesses the zone of discrimination as target variable, whose values in relation to Z superscript score may be safe zone, gray zone, distress zone. The goal of the experiment is to test the ability of the algorithm to identify a combination of variables to predict the target without considering the variables cutoff and z-score in the dataset. This experiment identifies 8 if-then rules and of consequence the best practices that generate the respective decision tree. Here, the decision tree of the first experiment is illustrated. The variables involved in this experiment are total debt on total liabilities and equity, return on assets, earnings before interest and taxes, non-current assets on total assets, and sales. In detail, these are the first 3 levels of the decision tree, then the levels from 4 to 6, and finally the last 2 levels. The second experiment assesses the cutoff as target variable, whose values in relation to Z superscript score may be potential solvency or possible distress. The goal of the experiment is to test the ability of the algorithm to identify a combination of variables to predict the target without considering the variables zone of discrimination and z-score in the dataset. This experiment identifies 9 if-then rules and, of consequence, the best practices that generate the respective decision tree. Here, the decision tree of the second experiment is illustrated. The variables involved in this experiment are total debt on total liabilities and equity, return on assets, total debt due beyond the financial year, personal cost on sales. These are the first 3 levels of the decision tree, then the levels from 4 to 6, and finally the last 3 levels. And now the findings of the research. Artificial intelligence allows to identify a new basket of variables different from those employed by the Altman-Z superscript score that determine the company's distress. Decision trees automatically identify the combination of variables from the dataset from 2 to 7 out of 101 variables that explains the 2 target variables according to a different perspective that is not considered by Z superscript score and that seem plausible from a technical point of view. All the new variables are able to catch up different sides of the company's financial profile, and so they are translatable into a model to understand the company's financial health. It is possible to analyze in which way these variables get along with each other in order to produce with accuracy the correct identification of the target variable. Finally, some conclusions. The experiments performed show the existence of an algorithm able to identify a combination of variables to predict the target without considering other 2 variables, respectively cutoff and z-score in the experiment 1 and zone of discrimination and z-score in the experiment 2 in the dataset. The contribution of the study is the identification of 2 algorithms able to determine 2 settings of if-then rules that produce the same outcomes obtainable through the application of the Altman-Z superscript score model without using it. Thanks to the combination of a new set of variables, it is possible to understand with a given accuracy the company's financial health and conversely the company's distress, regardless of Altman-Z superscript score. The current development of the research reveals that the methodology still needs to be adapted, determining plausible interval for the variables identified by the decision trees. However, the identified algorithms are powerful tools that strengthen the comprehension of companies' financial profile. Since they work with large amounts of data, they are even more significant. Artificial intelligence methodology is able to process large amounts of records within a given dataset, so allowing to test the effectiveness of legality rating in the assessment of creditworthiness. Here, some references used for this presentation. Thank you for your attention. Bye!